Hello everybody, so the New York Times recently did an advert that said, Liana is imagining Harry Potter without its creator. In other words, imagining if Harry Potter, the books written by J.K. Rowling, had in fact not been written by J.K. Rowling, that J.K. Rowling didn't exist, and that therefore the books could be enjoyed without, being confronted with the knowledge that it was written by somebody who disagrees with you. Now, on the surface, this is pretty obviously immoral for the simple reason that J.K. Rowling hasn't really done anything wrong. Like, even if you think J.K. Rowling is wrong, then that doesn't really make her morally evil, you know? The reality is J.K. Rowling receives a lot of vitriol for stuff that's actually pretty tame in the grand scheme of things. Ultimately, I realized the principal reason why J.K. Rowling's been subject to so much attack when plenty of people, like myself, say stuff that is far more critical of the concept of gender identity is because J.K. Rowling simply has a larger platform. But when you think about it, the implications of that are deeply anti-feminist. It's essentially saying that as women become more powerful and more influential, they're going to face increasing misogynistic backlash, not proportional to any genuine issues of what they're saying, but rather proportional just to the platform they have from which they can question certain things, particularly things relating to, for example, how the idea of being a woman is understood. J.K. Rowling's concerns were pretty unambiguously motivated by concerns about women's rights. So if you find what J.K. Rowling said so offensive that you can't even countenance the idea of her existing, then that suggests a pretty deep level of misogyny, and of course, since misogyny is bad, to display that level of misogyny by disliking the idea of J.K. Rowling even existing because J.K. Rowling has stood up for women's rights and thought critically about how it makes sense to understand the category of women, that would be immoral. But of course, there is another question, which is this even moral if J.K. Rowling had done something wrong? You know, I don't think there's a very credible argument that J.K. Rowling has done anything particularly bad. Again, even if you disagree with her, she might have said some incorrect stuff. I don't think she really has, but even if you thought that doesn't mean that she's immoral. I think that the morality of what J.K. Rowling said is perfectly fine. But the question is, even if she had done something immoral, would it be justified to deny her creative work? You know, the reality is that people have described this New York Times ad as chilling. That was I saw that in the Telegraph saying, this is chilling. I can understand why people think that. It's not necessarily, if people had just said, I don't like J.K. Rowling and think she's immoral, people would respond negatively to that, and indeed as people have been responding negatively to that. But also the reason why people have been responding negatively to that is because people have been saying that for like the last 2 years. Lots of people don't like what J.K. Rowling has been saying, but that reality is not in itself chilling. What is chilling is this idea of fundamentally just denying J.K. Rowling's creative work. And the reality is that J.K. Rowling worked hard to come up with these ideas. And people are to varying degrees fans of Harry Potter. I think it's pretty entertaining. I don't think it's like the best thing ever. I've never been, I guess, what's it called, a Potterhead. But I've always actually enjoyed at least a significant portion of the kind of Harry Potter franchise. And the question becomes, is it ever appropriate for somebody who really does enjoy the Harry Potter franchise, enjoy it so much that the idea of J.K. Rowling's beliefs actually really negatively affects them? For me personally, like, my interest in J.K. Rowling is actually more attached to her, being involved in the gender identity debate than it has to do with Harry Potter. Like I say, I liked Harry Potter, wasn't a massive fan of it. But ultimately, there are other people who really like Harry Potter. And the question becomes, can those people who should, by all accounts, be incredibly appreciative of this work, deny the reality that an author put huge amounts of work into creating this thing? Is it ever morally appropriate or morally acceptable to deny somebody else's effort in bringing something into existence, something you appreciate, something you enjoy, something that brings joy to you, to deny that somebody actually produced that was somebody's work, that they, slaved over to, make it good? And clearly, I mean, if you think it's really great, clearly you think it's good. Liana seems to be a big fan of Harry Potter. Imagining Harry Potter, it's important enough to get this advert. Nobody's getting really worked up about, Anthony Horowitz's 1980s books, Gruesome Grange, about a wizard school where, children go to learn magic, because, people don't really care about Anthony Horowitz's Gruesome Grange series. But people care about Harry Potter. And the question was, if you're really enjoying it, can you just say, yeah, but this person who created it, who cares? But any more substantial critique of this kind of notion of imagining Harry Potter without its creator ultimately comes down to the question of what does that mean more specifically? And that is a question I'm just going to leave aside for a minute as I explore this concept of unpersoning people more in more detail. This idea of just saying, this person doesn't exist. I'm imagining Harry Potter without its creator, aka I'm imagining J.K. Rowling, gone. So there's this YouTube channel called JXE, and I would say this, okay, I like JXE. I think JXE produces good content. But the thing is, J is trans-identified of some sort. I've never actually quite worked out exactly what's going on with, the exact identity. It seems to have moved around a bit, but definitely there's some kind of trans identity going on there, which of course, me personally, I'm like, well, trans identity is a load of complete nonsense. But that doesn't change the fact that JXE produces work on YouTube that I actually think is pretty good quality. And it's mostly film reviews, TV reviews, stuff like that. And ultimately, I'm not going to, it would be completely absurd of me just because I believe that the idea of trans identity is deeply misogynistic and offensive, and JXE clearly believes that trans identity is valid, for me to just based on that, refuse to engage with JXE's work, or indeed to argue that JXE is not in fact the one producing this work. Although, perhaps I should, because in JXE's review of Doctor Who, and I don't like Doctor Who. Well, I've not really seen Doctor Who. I'm not a fan of it. And yet I have watched JXE's over 5-hour-long video about Doctor Who, because that's just how interesting I find media analysis. I often find media analysis more interesting than the actual media itself. And sometimes I'll be like, I won't watch a whole season of Doctor Who, but I will watch a massive video talking about all the problems with, a season of Doctor Who. Anyway, in that video, JXE talks about the idea of Richard Ayoade becoming the next Doctor, or, one of the possible Doctors. And of course, Richard Ayoade kind of broke out with his role in the IT Crowd, where he played the character of Moss. And the IT Crowd, if you didn't know, was created by Graham Linehan. And if you didn't know the IT Crowd, or you didn't know it was created by Graham Linehan, you probably at least know who Graham Linehan is. You probably have some variety of different opinions on him. And certainly I'm not going to say he's a figure who, even within the gender critical community, does not court some controversy. But the important thing is that whether you like him, whether you hate him, he made the IT Crowd. He also made Father Ted, and I think he's made a few other shows too. And basically, JXE doesn't like Graham Linehan, because Graham Linehan also thinks the idea of trans identity is nonsense and offensive, just like I do. So JXE decides to say that the IT Crowd was written not by Graham Linehan, but by Harris Brewer, aka H. Bomber Guy.
The IT Crowd, a funny little British comedy written by Harry Brewis.
Now, far be it from me to suggest that H. Bomber Guy, who, clearly has a fantastic work ethic to be uploading, a whole video every year. Wow, he really does pull out all the stops. I suspect he wouldn't actually have the work ethic necessary to produce an entire season, never mind a TV show running 4 seasons of pretty high quality, entertaining comedy. I think they're saying that he produced this TV show which has quite a long combined runtime, filled with lots of clever writing and plot twists and all that kind of stuff. I think that's not really accurate, and you might say be a little bit more accurate to say that the person who wrote the IT Crowd was the person who in fact wrote the IT Crowd, Graham Linehan. And the whole thing's really quite interesting, because it's not saying I don't like that this piece of media I enjoy was written by somebody I don't like. Rather, it's claiming this person I don't like didn't even produce this piece of media I enjoy. It's not, the IT Crowd was written by Graham Linehan and I don't like Graham Linehan. No, it's the IT Crowd wasn't written by Graham Linehan, even though it in actual reality was. So unpersoning is basically one of those Orwellian terms, meaning, coined, possibly not coined originally, but certainly popularized by the works of Orwell. The idea with unpersoning is you don't kill somebody, you don't, make them disappear, you make it so that they even ceased to exist. You make it so, actually, this person didn't exist in actual reality. This person is no longer a person. They're not there. Now, there is a famous example, outside of dystopian fiction where this idea of unpersoning emerged, and that was, of course, under the regime of Stalin. We've all seen the memes where you take various people, obviously Trotsky and I think lots of Trotskyites, who were, in earlier pictures of Stalin, pictured with him, and then in later pictures, they've been removed. They've been unpersoned. They're not even there anymore. And the thing about Stalin is, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that he certainly did some bad stuff. Some of his stuff more excusable than others. Some of his stuff clearly not necessarily malicious, but with an actual purpose. For example, collectivization. The point of collectivizing farming wasn't just to, kill people or something like that. The point of collectivizing farming was to make farms more productive. Ultimately, Stalin did some bad stuff. He did some all right stuff. And overall, I'm pretty sure that most people would not claim that Stalin was by any means perfect, though. So I think we can all agree on that. Now, the thing is, though, unpersoning, of all the things this very imperfect person did, unpersoning is generally regarded as the most chilling and sinister thing for him to have done. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we have this idea that the truth can't be, it presents a limit to human power. Like a human being can be powerful. They can make people do stuff. They can make people say stuff. They can, of course, prohibit people from doing or saying stuff. But they can't make things true or untrue. At least if we're talking about very kind of essential things. For example, numbers is a classic example. They can't make 2 + 2 = 4. And also, of course, you can't make somebody not be a person anymore. You can't, in reality, actually unperson somebody. You can tell, you can erase all evidence of me, you can do whatever else, you can pretend that I don't exist, but you can't make it so I don't exist. And even if you kill me so I don't in that sense exist, you can't make it so I didn't exist. You can't change the reality that I was here, that I am, that I am part of the universe. You can't change that because it's just undeniably true. Indeed, from my perspective, if we're running with Descartes, the only thing I know is that I exist. It's literally the only thing, perhaps, that I can be 100% confident of. So I can say with a lot of confidence that you can't make it so I don't exist. You can't actually unperson me. You could kill me, and in that sense, I wouldn't exist in that exact moment, but I would still exist right now. You can't change the fact that right now I'm existing. Right now I'm existing. There's nothing you can do, no matter how powerful. If you're the most powerful dictator in the world, you can't change the fact that right now I exist. And in some sense, obviously, that should be a reassurance. But I think the concern is seeing people try to make it so, the attempt to unperson somebody. Because we would say, well, in reality, you can't unperson somebody. But to see people even attempt it is scary. Because, of course, that's the one thing you can't do. You can't change reality. Reality is the supreme dictator. And it's an impartial dictator. It's truth. And you can't dictate truth. Truth is dictated by reality itself. So the idea of unpersoning ends up kind of complex. On the one hand, you can't do it, so it shouldn't be a concern. On the other hand, it's kind of terrifying that somebody would try to do it, because it's like they're pushing against what you would think would be the one thing that no authoritarian, no matter how mad they are, no matter how crazy they are, no matter how zealous they are, should be able to do, or even entertain the maniacal notion that they would be able to do it. Gender Trouble is a book by Judith Butler. I read it way back when I was, initially reading lots of feminist literature just to kind of try to familiarize myself with feminism. And I went into it thinking it would be like, actually arguing for feminism. And it doesn't. You start reading it and you're just very confused, because you're like, oh, I thought I was supposed to be reading about why feminism is correct or something, because this is considered a foundational text of third wave feminism. And you would think, that other foundational texts of other waves of feminism at least had some kind of good argumentative quality to them for why feminism was correct. But this book doesn't really argue why feminism is correct. I don't think any anti-feminist would ever read this book and come away with the conclusion that feminism is correct. We know, for example, that the second sex, one of the foundational texts of second wave feminism, can convince an anti-feminist to become a feminist, because that happened. I made a video about how that happened. I read the second sex, and basically there were lots of arguments in it, and ultimately, some of those arguments I didn't find entirely convincing, but overall, in that pretty substantial book, lots of the arguments in it were convincing enough. They really did change my mind. That's not going to happen with this. The possibly it might have been The Onion, or it could have been Clickhole, which is kind of related to The Onion, did a parody video on like the idea of a working class kind of coal miner or whatever reading Judith Butler and changing his mind.
I like Trump because I thought he tells it like it is. But you know who really tells it like it is? Judith Butler. Gender is not to culture as sex is to nature. Gender is also the discursive, cultural means by which sex nature, or a natural sex, is produced and established as predecursive prior to culture, a politically neutral surface on which culture acts. If I had just known that back in November, I would have never voted for Trump.
I think that's kind of hilarious, isn't it? The idea that the very idea of somebody reading this book and changing their mind is something to be parodied. Like the very idea anyone would pick up this book, read it and be like, oh, I never thought about it like that before. Oh, how could I have been so silly? How could I have been so wrong? That idea is something to be mocked, and it's something that indeed is mocked. But like I say, I first read this book before I knew anything about being gender critical. I then read it again when I was kind of exploring gender critical ideas early on, because I kind of actually realized a bit more about the whole gender identity thing. I was like, oh, so that's what this book is supposed to be about. Because that's the point. This book isn't trying to convince anybody that feminism is true. This book is simply arguing within feminism. This book is saying, well, what should feminism be, blah, blah, blah. This is a book to talk about feminism. Even though it's a foundational book for third wave feminism, it's not arguing for feminism. It's simply saying, well, what should feminism be? And of course, what should feminism be about? With the particular focus on women. What are women? And why should feminism be about them? And what does it mean for feminism to be about women? That's the big question Butler's getting at. So I read it again. Beauvoir turns to the failed reciprocity of an asymmetrical dialectic, while Irigare suggests that the dialectic itself is the monologic elaboration of a masculinist signifying economy. It's all like this. You can turn to any page. It's all like this. And the reality is you read it and you're kind of like, okay, I can sort of kind of understand what's being said, but it's a bit annoying having to spend a huge amount of time working out what's even trying to be said before you can even get into the question of whether or not what's being said actually makes much sense. And I do think that's probably the principal argumentative force of this book, that the time you've really worked out what the writing is trying to communicate, maybe you're out of any kind of analytic energy to consider whether or not what it's trying to communicate makes sense. So I'm going to, for my part, try to explain performativism, because performativism is kind of what this book is. I don't know if this is most accurately what this book is about, but it's definitely an idea that Judith Butler has advocated for, performativism. And I will explain what performativism is. So it's really easy to explain. It's so easy that you really don't need a 180 or so page long. No, it's 200. Okay, well done. You don't need like a 200 page long book filled with sentences like that sentence just read there to explain the concept. Not to say that that was the only thing Butler was trying to do, but I'll explain performativism. So, if somebody says, a boss says to an employee, "You're fired," they're not just saying you're fired. They are firing that person. So there we go. That's what performativism is. But obviously, philosophically, there is substance to it as an observation. Basically, the point being made is that sometimes words aren't just words. They're also actions. You aren't just saying blah, 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 blah. You are doing this action. You aren't just saying you're fired. You are firing that person. And of course, significantly right now, I'm saying the words "you're fired," but I'm not firing anybody. So "you're fired" doesn't always mean that I'm firing somebody. But of course, lots of the time, "you're fired" does mean you are firing somebody. That's an action you're doing. And yeah, there we go. That's it, basically. Sometimes words are actions. That's essentially what performativism is. Now, what Judith Butler tries to argue is that the words we use around gender are similarly actions. In other words, and you can pretty much work out where we're going here. If I say, "I'm a woman," I'm not just saying words. I am becoming a woman. That basically, when we use gendered language, in the same way that if you fire somebody, you're actually performing an action of firing somebody, in identifying as a woman, you are performing the action of becoming, or indeed being, a woman. And you may now notice why it is that I speculated that perhaps Judith Butler writes in such needlessly complicated language in order to make it so that people, when they're confronted with these kind of claims, don't really have the energy to think about whether or not what's being said makes sense. Because the question is, does it really make sense? Does that make sense to say that if I say I'm a woman, I'm performing the action of becoming a woman? Of course, the reality is that performativism is true. It's not so much a theory as it is just an aspect of linguistics correctly described. Of course, there are words and statements which, and the other example is "I do" in marriage. You are marrying somebody. Marrying somebody, in some sense, is a speech act. It's an action you do by saying a series of words. But clearly, it's a speech act in a very different sense to how what I'm doing right now is a speech act. I am talking to you. I am communicating information to you. But that's kind of all I'm doing. I'm not, in doing this, I'm not marrying you, for example, right now. I'm not firing you. I'm not actually fundamentally changing reality in any sense by saying any of the words that I'm saying right now. But what you may notice is, of course, so let's try to make this make sense. So basically, obviously, the reason why if I can use the human language to marry somebody, or I can use the human language to fire somebody, or I can use the human language to promote or hire, or dismiss somebody temporarily without pay. I can do all of these things using the human language. And the reason I can do that is because these are things that were just made up by humans. So with this logic in mind, you could say, well, the categories of man or woman were made up by human beings, right? So can't you just say I'm a woman and become a woman? Doesn't it work the exact same way? Which is a bad logic for several reasons. The first reason, of course, being that just because a concept is made up by human beings, it doesn't mean that there is no it doesn't mean it's a complete free-for-all. Marriage is made up by human beings, and yet even still, it's not as if it's just completely, there are no rules for performativism. The reality is that there are very specific things that need to be said. The speech act of marrying somebody is a very kind of established thing. And ultimately, for example, there is no confusion right now that I am not marrying you. Even though marriage is just made up by human beings, the reality is that there is still a very specific speech act that results in somebody getting married. And what I'm doing right now is not that. There are strict rules for these things. And by that logic, you would therefore say, well, if there are rules for this, then we would have to ask, we have a way that you can use speech acts to marry somebody. Do we have a way that you can use speech acts to become a man or become a woman? And the answer would seem to be no. I'm not aware of any way we can use language that way. I don't think that's a very established thing in our society. But of course, there is another issue here, which is that this is all assuming that the categories of man and woman only describe or are things entirely made up by society. And that's not necessarily the best way to understand the categories of man and woman. You would have to argue that it is, and that's of course the whole issue. The question is, should being a man or woman be understood as describing something beyond biological reality? Because of course biological reality is not something we invented. We didn't invent biology. We certainly didn't invent sexual reproduction. It was around long before us. So we indeed didn't invent the two phenotypes centered around the production of small and large gametes. So we didn't invent any of these things. And therefore, the question becomes, if that is what man and woman is describing, then it's not something that we can simply say, well, I do this and I do that. But of course, even in the case of femininity and masculinity, the fact that there are strict rules is very relevant here. While you could say perhaps that there are certain speech acts which cause you to be feminine, ultimately, those speech acts are very specific. And this idea, again, of gender ceasing to mean anything, or, becoming completely void of any substantial meaning, isn't even, upheld or evidenced by the idea that performativism would apply to our understandings of gender. So Judith Butler is wrong. I don't think anything Judith Butler is really getting at is particularly compelling, or certainly not convincing. And, I think ultimately that it's 100% true to say what Judith Butler's trying to do is just use nonsense language to try to defend a nonsense concept. But it's worth remembering again that Gender Trouble is a foundational text of the modern gender identity movement. And what is its big claim? Well, its big claim is that words are actions, and that when you say something, you can often do something. And also, the big claim is that you should not be particularly skeptical about what it is that certain words can do. Because of course, Judith Butler does not put huge amounts of effort into evidencing the idea that in particular, the categories of man and woman can be affected by speech acts. Rather, just the general idea that speech acts can affect reality is used to evidence the idea that, well, yeah, of course, it makes sense to say that speech acts in this case do affect reality. So it's essentially very much opening up this idea of performativism. And you therefore have to confront a difficult question at the center of gender identity ideology. If performativism can be used in combination with this concept of gender identity to argue that performativism through identification with a particular gender does produce real, actual results, why could that not also equally apply to unpersoning? And considering how much gender identity and gender identity advocacy uses the tactic of unpersoning, the tactic of denying that Graham Linehan wrote the TV shows he did, that J.K. Rowling wrote the books and did the world building for Harry Potter that she did. Considering their willingness to use this, and their willingness also to be incredibly broad in their understanding of performativism, should this give us another layer upon which we could really recognize the potential danger of gender identity? Of course, there are innumerable potential dangers to gender identity, but might this quite credibly be one of the most sinister out there? So it's worth returning to the question of what exactly does it mean when you say imagining Harry Potter without its creator? Does this just have implications for intellectual property? Is it just something that somebody's making up completely in their head? Is it about how somebody's going to talk about Harry Potter? How somebody's going to analyze Harry Potter? Is it going to give somebody some kind of are they going to have to wrestle with the question of how this book just appeared out of nowhere? Does it relate, of course, as obviously Lindsay Ellis has a video talking about this, does it relate to death of the author? Does it, for example, have implications for how we might interpret Harry Potter? These are all very interesting questions to consider. Of course, they're questions which I think we shouldn't need to consider, because the idea of imagining Harry Potter without its creator shouldn't really be a thing. But considering the fact that it clearly is a thing, it's kind of worth considering what exactly does that mean. Of course, it's just one of many things relating to gender identity and gender identity advocacy where you have to ask the question, what exactly does that mean? Recognizing you're probably never going to really get a clear answer. And that's sort of the issue. It could mean almost anything. And what you realize is that language is being used in this very vague, nebulous way. Just, we're going to imagine that the author doesn't exist. Just going to imagine J.K. Rowling no longer, just gone. And that idea of language being so vague, combined with performativism, which takes this idea that language can also be incredibly powerful, could very easily be the underpinnings of an immensely and unimaginably authoritarian ideology. The idea of the complete vagary and arbitrariness of language in combination with the assertion that language is immensely powerful to the extent it has significant degrees of control over reality itself. And it seems like what performativism has done in combination with gender identity, as first put forward by this book here, Gender Trouble by Judith Butler, is taken something which is already recognized as an incredibly sinister and terrifying notion, and somehow made it even more terrifying and sinister. So here's the thing, Kate. Does this mean that gender identity extremism is this massive threat? Well, it's hard to say. Ultimately, it's always tempting to just think that gender identity extremism is a pretty impotent force because of how stupid it is. Like, it's so silly, it's so ridiculous. It's quite difficult to take gender identity seriously as a threat to the idea of kind of objectivity and truth itself, because it seems like the more that this idea is actually influencing society, the more people are realizing it's nonsense. And you could say, well, clearly, eventually, they're just going to spread their ideas to enough people are just going to realize this is wrong, and actually, the gender critical side will win. And, that is definitely the optimistic view. My only concern, just to end it on a slightly more pessimistic view, is what if these ideas were harnessed by a different movement? The future is unpredictable, and it's quite hard to really know what will be the great evils of the future. And of course, trying to predict it, I think, is just destined for failure. The reality is the only thing we can do is hope that future generations are equipped to respond to terrible ideas, terrible movements, different new manifestations of evil. But I don't think it is insanely improbable that this combination of unpersoning with this notion of performativism could be one such evil that might have to be confronted at one point, because it might emerge as a significantly more dramatic evil for future generations. So that's one reason to be motivated to oppose these ideas now. both this kind of incredibly broad understanding of performativism, which is totally detaching it from the reality of when speech acts genuinely can exist, and trying to just turn it into, through vagary, turn this idea of just generally bringing about changes in reality just through declaring things to be true. And of course, that's especially a concern in combination with this idea of unpersoning, which we are right to identify as chilling and concerning and indeed sinister, and to call it out whenever we see it. And of course, certainly never to engage in that kind of behavior ourselves, unless, of course, as a pretty obvious kind of joke designed to make fun of people who engage in unpersoning themselves. Anyway, so that's kind of the end of the video. I hope you found it interesting. Please do comment below to let me know what you think. You can share, like, subscribe, all of that kind of stuff. It was all really appreciated. You can, of course, give on Patreon, and that is also appreciated very much so. Ultimately, what I'd like to be able to do is work on kind of more cerebral video concepts like this in the future, and that would be helped by being able to kind of consult more literature, and that does mean having more kind of free time that I can afford to dedicate to this, and giving on Patreon very much does help with that. So with that said, I'll also just say, you can check out Twitter, you can check out my Gilded. There's great conversations happening there sometimes, and I'll just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past on your screen right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons, Charlotte, Sambuca, and Skeptical. You're all very appreciated.